Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Divya Murali, a research associate at the Institute. In today's episode, I will be speaking to Mr. Stephen Olson on navigating the fractured landscape of tariffs, trade, and tensions. Stephen is a senior visiting fellow at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute, Singapore, and also a non-resident fellow at the Utah Institute of International Trade and Finance, University of Nebraska, United States. He is a recognized trade expert and a former U.S. trade negotiator himself. There is no better person to lend some perspective on this complex and rapidly changing landscape of tariff and trade, and how do the world and South Asia navigate this fractured landscape where trade as we know it is challenged and with it at stake is millions of jobs, industry, and diplomacy. Welcome to South Asia Chat, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the big picture. How would you characterize this current moment in global trade? Are we witnessing a temporary disruption driven by politics, or would you say that the foundations of the post-WTO trade system is being permanently reshaped?
I think you're starting in exactly the right place. There's no question from my point of view that we're at a real historical inflection point in which the 8-decade rules-based trade system that's been in place since the end of the Second World War and has been a primary driver of economic development and growth in every corner of the globe is really in the process of collapsing before our eyes. It's not really clear what will emerge, but I think, unfortunately, we're going to be tilting at least somewhat back in the direction of law of the jungle.
So let us explore the newness that is emerging, the new trade architecture that the United States has been adopting. We are seeing a new style of a trade deal emerging from Washington, one that's often specifically transactional, if one could say that. For instance, the deal matrix seems to be made up of some combination of elements like purchase commitments, guarantees on dismantling non-tariff barriers, digital access, investment packages, so on and so forth, and some non-economic aspects woven into the fabric of the new architecture as well. Given that the US is the largest economy in the world, it does operate from a position of strength. In this context, from your perspective, what are the ingredients of a successful negotiation with the US in such a high-stakes environment, particularly for countries that necessarily don't have a good leverage or hedge? And how sustainable do you think this approach realistically is?
Well, look, I think you have to negotiate with one hand and with the other hand diversify your trade and investment relationships as quickly as you can, because I think irrespective of any agreements that may or may not be reached with countries, I think the trade relationship with the United States is going to continue to be chaotic. And unfortunately, I think the United States is proving itself to be an unreliable trading partner. So I think to the extent you have leverage, use it as best as you can, but understand your relations with the United States are changing, and it would make sense to diversify your relationships away from the U.S. to the extent you're able.
So, to this new complicated and emerging environment, we also have another labyrinth. Recently, a U.S. court ruling has called parts of Trump administration tariffs unlawful. Adding a legal wrinkle to this complex picture, what kind of precedent does this set, and how might it affect future trade talks or existing deals?
It's interesting. This court case has gotten a lot of attention, but to be honest, I don't see it necessarily as a game changer. Even if the Supreme Court ultimately was able to rule against these tariffs, the president has a variety of different authorities that he could use to basically reconstruct a similar tariff regime as is currently in place. Now, the reason they went with IEEPA, which is the authority that they've used for the reciprocal tariffs, is because it's most convenient. It was the easiest, most suitable, most convenient authority for them to use. But there's Section 301, there's Section 232. The president's got a lot of authority when it comes to tariffs. It'll be a little bit more complicated. It'll be a little bit more difficult. It will be a little bit more cumbersome. But I don't think anyone should expect that even if the court rules against the Trump tariffs, that will throw his reciprocal tariff regime on the scrap heap. I think they'll find other ways to largely do the same things.
Will it make it complicated for the businesses?
It makes it an absolute nightmare for the businesses. I don't know how companies around the world can plan their supply chains when the tariff environment is so changeable. So this is a very significant complication for business.
Right. So pivoting a little bit and to dwell on the larger U.S. relations, and particularly probably a little bit focus on the U.S.-India disconnect that's been emerging. So India is often called a key strategic partner for the U.S., particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Yet on trade, there really seems to be some growing disconnect. How do negotiating countries balance strategic relationships with tough economic asks? And when do these interests actually start to collide?
I think we're living in a world where countries have to accept the fact that the security considerations and the trade considerations and economic considerations are intertwined. And even more so than Trump, everything is on the table in a trade negotiation with Trump, in a trade action with Trump. We've seen tariffs on Brazil because of a court case against a former president. So any aspect of the relationship can be drawn into the trade discussion. So I think that has to be understood. There's no longer any dividing line between trade and security.
So in this emerging environment, looking ahead, where global alliances are actually in a flux, how should countries from South Asia and the global South prepare for a future where trade rules may shift with each administration?
I think we have to understand that we're in a fundamentally new era. We've had an 8-decade period in which it became progressively easier to do business across borders. And now we're entering into a very different era in which it will grow more difficult, more expensive, more chaotic, higher tariffs rather than lower tariffs. So I think as a practical matter, for a lot of countries, the export-led development model, which has been pursued with great success by so many countries in the region, is no longer going to be open to the same extent it has been in the past.
If I could probe it a little bit more, what should these countries be asking for at the table, and what should they actually look to protect?
Well, look, I think when you sit down across the negotiating table from the Trump administration, from Donald Trump to a certain extent, you have to recognize his formative experience with negotiations is as a New York real estate developer. And really, the primary thing that Trump understands is leverage. Now, if you're lacking leverage, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to make any headway with Trump. I think we've seen China be very skillful in exploiting the leverage it has on critical materials, critical minerals, and other things. But for those countries that can't bring that same degree of leverage to the table, they're going to find themselves in a very difficult situation. So I think make the best arrangements you can, but at the same time be planning to diversify away from the United States to the maximum extent you can.
So is regional trade frameworks the answer to these countries, or do you think they should hedge their bets globally?
I think globally. I think globally. Certainly in the ASEAN region, there have been efforts at turning the region into a single market, a single production base. It hasn't materialized to quite the level of ambition that I think many people were hoping for. That's largely because a lot of the economies within the region compete with each other rather than having complementary economic needs. So I think it's time to really look further afield. I think Europe, Middle East should be near the top of that list for countries in the region.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a quick, insightful, and interesting conversation that we had. Trade can often seem technical, but as we've heard today and we live through it, it does become evident that it sits in the intersection of power, politics, and people's livelihoods. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also follow us on social media. We are on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.